What we were doing was illegal. We knew that. And therefore it added a certain excitement to it. And that's very true. But Reg Kilduff had a very good understanding with the police. Although the Union pub was raided and the Cheshire Cheese were raided and the drag acts were prosecuted for committing offences by using profane language and so on, the Rembrandt was never touched in any way, shape or form, nor was the Rockingham, except they got a phone call every so often because the licence in those days for after 11 o'clock at night till 2 in the morning was a supper licence. So you had to be eating in order to drink alcohol. And they would get a telephone call at the Rockingham to say there was a raid tonight at such and such a time. So 10 minutes before the raid was due, we were all given a paper plate and a piece of frozen fish and a plastic fork. And we had to stand there with these things in our hands. And the buzzer went on the door, and in trooped about 6 police constables, helmets on, everything, and walked round looking at the fact that we all had plates with food to accompany our drinks. And then they all trooped out again. And staff came round, retrieved the frozen fish and put it back in the freezer. And probably kept the plates as well. And 15 minutes, 20 minutes later, the buzzer goes again, and in come the same 6 policemen, take their helmets off, sit down at the bar, and the beer is put back on for them. After time, we were only allowed to drink from the top shelf, whiskies, gins and things, because they were more expensive. The beer was shut off at closing time. But for the police, it was put back on again.
When I was quite an unhappy person in those days. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You were?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about that? Ken?
Yeah. In those days, I didn't have any friends, to be honest. And so my best friends were my records. I know they call them vinyls these days, but to me, they'll always be records. Mm-hmm. And I've still got them from when I was that age, because I just can't part with them. And I still play them. I never bonded with my dad, so it was a difficult relationship. I used to go to the cinema a lot, especially on Sundays. I'd go to the cinema. But the reason I was unhappy is I wanted to transition from male to female. Yeah. In those days, if I watched Top of the Pops, I fancied the pop stars of the Beatles, Dave Clark, lots of pop stars in them days. I was fancying different actors. And my mind has always been more feminine. And it worried me that I was attracted to men. But I was also attracted to women. So I wanted they called it in those days, 1967, it would have been called a sex change. The word transitioning wasn't really in public too much. And as you know, I was admitted into hospital, had electroconvulsive therapy. And when I came out, I realised I had to get on with life. And it wasn't 2 years later I realised I was bisexual. Because I never heard of the word bisexual. I was rather naive in those days. I hadn't heard my parents never spoke about anything to do with sex or anything like that. And I didn't have any friends, so it was tough. It was really, really tough.
There was nothing about sexuality. There wasn't any boys I was particularly attracted to. I think just sexuality just went on the back burner. The nearest I got really to hearing about things was via the radio. I used to enjoy Round the Horn with its characters Julian and Sandy. But when I was 14 and 15, what was then the Sexual Offences Bill was going through Parliament. First it went through the House of Lords. There was a bill introduced by Lord Arran, and subsequently the one by Leo Absey that was introduced into the House of Commons. And periodically on the radio they would have little snippets about the progress of the bill through Parliament. And I remember one particular one where they had a little section in the programme where they went to Amsterdam, to the COC club, and the reporter was describing men dancing with men, and I thought, oh, this is fabulous. Not everywhere is like this, because all Wigan had was cottages.
I remember news bulletins about the Wolfenden report, and then, of course, the Act was passed. But I was growing up, I knew by that time I was gay, and I knew that it was something you didn't talk about. It was something you should feel ashamed of. And we're talking about a time when nobody had a mobile phone. The internet didn't exist. So the only way to meet people anyway was to go out.
And then I was going to mention Canal Street, because Canal Street was gay then, because the Union was there and the Rembrandt was there. But the street was lit by 2 gas lamps. So there was no light in the street at all. So you picked something up in the Union, you went up an alley just across the canal. There were the old warehouses still there, empty, derelict. What a wonderful place to go. Tripping over other guys doing the same sort of thing. So it was all much more exciting then than it is today. We used to do the ones, the Cheshire Cheese was up Oldham Road. There was the Queen's, and there was the Café Royal opposite the Theatre Royal, and so on. So we moved around the town, and you met people as you're coming out and you're saying, "Ooh, it's dead in the Union tonight. Dead in the Union tonight. We've just been in the Cheshire Cheese. It's good. Some right nice talent. And, oh, right, we'll go there." And so you wandered round the town.
In some ways, because when I was in my 20s, 30s and 40s, there were gay bars. They were just bars that were known to be full of gay men. And occasionally there'd be a woman in there with a group of gay men. But you could say almost certainly that all the men in that bar were gay. So you could approach them. You could chat them up. The gay bars I'm talking about were open all the way through the day. You're going for lunch. You're going after work. You didn't have to wait until late at night because you weren't necessarily going to try and pick somebody up. You were going to chat to gay men. And that might lead to you actually going home with them. But at the very least, you'd actually spoken to somebody for 5 minutes. There are no bars like that anymore. Which, for me, reinforces the isolation that many people feel.
In the gay bars, you met everyone. The lord of the manor was stood on one side of you, and the dustbin collector or the window cleaner was stood on the other side of it, and we all talked together and went off with each other. And there was no class about it at all. We were all gay. And that's what brought us there. So we shared one thing in common, that we were gay, and therefore we all had a bloody good time. And there were no such things as hen parties coming into our pubs. Not a chance. No, it was for the boys only. And you weren't allowed, the other thing in the Rockingham, you weren't allowed to dance together. You mustn't touch each other when you're dancing, because that was against the rules. It was against the law. You weren't allowed to touch each other because it was a supper license. So every so often Harry Bannister would be shouting, "Stop touching! Stop touching! You can't touch!" And then it came to, "This is your last dance of the evening," and put a record on the jukebox, because that's all that was available in the Rockingham. "This is your last dance of the evening, and this is your last chance of the evening." And everybody was allowed to touch and hug each other and dance close and get all excited. And then the bar closed and Harry came round. "Right, can we have your glasses, please?" Back bar. "Can we have your glasses, please?" Back bar. And all of us that were well known were in the back bar. And that went on the rest of the night.
One of the consequences of the 67 Act in some places, particularly in Manchester, was that the police decided they were going to crack down on cottaging, as it was called, and they would use what were known as pretty policemen. So they would deliberately send out young male police officers to go and hang around public lavatories to catch people, which they did. I was living in Oxford at the time, and it was 3 a.m, so there was nobody around. I was in the notorious cottage in the centre of Oxford, and there was this other chap there who turned out to be a policeman. So he arrested me, put me in handcuffs, walked me through the centre of Oxford at 3 a.m. to the police station.
And how old were you then?
21.
Wow.
So that was a bit later. And some years later, entrapment, as it was called, was banned. But I have 2 criminal convictions. And the recent quashing of historical sexual offence convictions doesn't apply to anything that happened in public lavatory. So I still have those 2 convictions on my record.
And to me, logically, it's the only place where you can meet men. And I carried on right the way through. And in 1972, I was arrested for gross indecency in Digbeth toilets. I didn't listen to my inner self, because next thing, the door was being kicked in. And then the sentencing came, and I had 2 years probation and 12 months of psychiatric treatment, which included electric shock. I went there for 3 sessions. This was in Erdington in Birmingham, at the Psyche Hospital. And I gave them these sessions. And about a mile down there was a cottage. And I'd have my sessions, and I'd go down the cottage. Such was my resilience and determination. I mean, I've struggled all my life. I survived family life. I survived school without changing. It was not a couple of probes on my head. Change that anyway.
Was the treatment that you were having, treatment in inverted commas you were having, a condition of the sentencing? So had you refused, there was no option basically?
No. Anyway, my probation officer called George, I can't remember his surname. I said, look, George, it's not working. I'm still who I am, it's not going to change me. And against all the odds, he went before the probation board. And with much opposition, he actually managed to get the psychiatric treatments quashed. And for that, I'll be ever indebted to him. He went on a line for me to get this quashed. And that was the start, really, of my little journey, or the start of my life journey.
And there was someone in to sit down, so I went in the one next door because there was a hole in the wall that you could look through. And I looked through and he was showing me what he had to play about with. And 1 minute later the doors were kicked open and 4 detectives grabbed us, dragged us out, got us into a police car and took us to the police station. And I refused to make any statement of any kind, but apparently the other guy made some kind of statement. And eventually I was charged with committing an act of gross indecency, which, to make life simpler, I simply pleaded guilty. And I was, although there was nothing gross and precious little indecent happened, we weren't given the opportunity. But I couldn't explain that to the magistrates. So I simply said guilty to an act of gross indecency. And I was fined £25 and £5 costs.
What year was that?
Possibly 73 sticks in mind. 1973. Why it sticks in my mind, I can't remember why, but I've put it down as 1973. So I have a criminal record of committing an act of gross indecency 40 years ago. At least I've never been called to do jury service, so it did me a little favour in that respect.
A number of my friends got sacked from their job. I was called into my manager's office in 1986. I've had some complaints. Go on. Oh, you're too open about your lifestyle. This is the sort of thing that happened. The clubs used to get raided regularly in those days. It's a completely different world. It's a bit difficult to explain to people who've never lived through that, just what it was like. You were in constant fear of attack or discrimination, even if it was not physical, it was certainly verbal. We had to be very careful. And the great thing about the youth club was that there were young people that weren't out anywhere else.
So things were very hidden, things were very different. When I started the gay sock in my college, a lot of hostility from people in the college. It was an all-male college, it was quite an aggressive college. There was a lot of hostility towards people who were openly gay, and I was then actually very openly gay. I was wearing gay badges at the time. I used to wear a huge badge that said, yes, I'm homosexual too. I wore a badge that said, how dare you assume I'm heterosexual. I wore Gay Liberation Front badges. And again, in those days, in the 70s, mid-70s, lots of people wore political badges. But to wear a badge saying you're openly gay at that time was quite unusual, really. So I was very open in that college environment in the town. I remember going to the early gay. My first gay pride march in London was in 1975. So I went on a very small gay pride march with lots and lots of police there and a lot of hostility from people. But again, there were big demonstrations, political demonstrations I went to in the early 70s when I was at college.
And of course then at the same time we'd had the Wolfenden report that took 10 years before it got to Parliament, and we had the Sexual Offences Act, and of course then it was widely discussed about being gay, and of course once it was legal, you could be in certain company, you could be a lot more open about it. In Macclesfield, I found out the Waters Green Tavern.
Yeah.
I'd met somebody else, and they said, "Oh, you should go in the Waters Green Tavern on I think it was a Tuesday night. It's full of gay people," and so I started going in there and meeting various persons.
And what was it like in there, Ron, at the time? Can you remember?
It was a busy pub. It's good. Everybody was having fun and chatting and saying which public toilets to avoid because the police were watching. And because a lot of agents provocateurs in those days, even though it was legal, they were still trying to nobble you because it was only legal to have sex, two of you in a locked room in private. So public toilets were strictly against the law, and that was vigorously enforced.
I remember going to clubs in the 80s, but not feeling fully safe to go to the village or to known gay clubs. And similarly, when I was leaving, I wouldn't feel safe until I'd made it inside the car, unlocked the car.
Yeah.
It was fine in the club if you weren't being raided. Particularly one I liked to go to was the Mine Shaft, and that was raided. Clubs were raided, saunas were raided. You had James Anderton, who saw himself almost as commanded by God to be virulently anti-gay, so police resources were particularly directed against the gay community. The sauna I'd mentioned earlier, Unit 1, two very close friends were there the night the police had raided. Police had gone in undercover at first and had been making notes about who'd been with who and all the rest, or who'd been seen to go off with whoever. And then the police raided, took down all the details and everything, kept them there for quite a while. took away all the mattresses, the bedding, the towels and everything. For what? I don't know. Presumably traces of semen. Not that that would prove anything had happened as such.
Camp Queens and sheeing.
Mm-hmm.
Was sheeing a thing?
Oh, yes. Oh, I mean, yes, in round the horn, oh, she's something awful, ain't she, Mr. Horn? And oh, listen to her. Well, we did that, of course. We always did, because we went in the Union and there were drag acts on in the Union and the Cheshire Cheese. And in the Union, every time, you didn't dare go for a piss in the Union because Ava, who was on the stage at the time, she would stop whatever she was doing and say, "It's going to the cottage, it's going to the cottage," and everybody sang it. So you didn't go to the cottage when she was on stage. So it was she, you see. The first time that Ian took me there to see a drag act, because I'd never seen a drag act in Glasgow, except pantomime. And he took me to the Union, and it was fantastic. I thought it was when the Cheshire Cheese, or Neville St. Clair was on, and Jackie Marshall, and so on. Neville's gone now, so I can mention his name. And in the Union was the first time I'd ever seen a drag act, and I went for a pee, you see. And the next thing is Charisse comes dancing in her miniskirt, pulls up the skirt, pulls down her pants, gets a great big cock out and has a piss. She says, "Ooh, I've been dying for this." Well, I was shocked out of my skull. I was absolutely flabbergasted. So the Union and the Cheshire Cheese and all these places were absolutely marvellous. And Diamond Lil, who passed away about 2 years ago, she was at the St. Vincent, which was an Oldham road, opposite the Cheshire Cheese, with Diamond Lil as the big drag act. And she was fun. As they all were, in fact.
There was a cafe bar called Snacks, SNAX, and I was a volunteer there. So we'd do that till 9, I think it closed at 9 and 10. And then what people would do then, around about 9:30, they'd go off to the pub. The Rembrandt, for me, in those days, which was really nice. It's then sort of all metal-y, and it was a traditional pub in those days, with proper seats and stuff. And go to the pub till 11, and then go to the nightclub, which in those days was only about £2 to get in, which was crazy. And used to go to High Society, which is long since closed, because you didn't have the concept of the village then, so the clubs were scattered all over the shop. You still had the area of Canal Street, but it was mainly disused warehouses. So it was a sort of hangout for prostitutes, male and female, gay and straight. So you had the Rembrandt, the New York, the Union, Napoleon's, and Bloom Street Cafe, and that was it.
And while I was down here, having discovered a few interesting cottages, and there was a very big one under Piccadilly Gardens.
What do you mean by cottage?
Public toilets, I think is the proper name, yes, but known to us as cottages. But public toilets, yes, and there was a huge public toilet underneath Piccadilly Gardens, which included a cloakroom where you could leave your parcels and your shopping and come back for it later for a small charge, and you'd do things like that with attendants in there. But it was so huge, there was places that they couldn't see very well. And being someone who obviously used cottages in Glasgow, when I came down here, that's the first thing I looked for. And I went in the toilet in Piccadilly and quite fancied this guy that was standing there, so moved quite close to him. And there was another guy moved quite close to him on the other side. And the one that we were chasing looked at both of us and walked out. So it left this guy and me. So we went behind Lewis's, which in those days the little streets behind Lewis's either had no lights or gas lamps. And we had an interesting little time there, and I met him again the next day and the day after that, and went back to where he worked from time to time. And it ended up that when I was supposed to go back to Glasgow, I went back to Glasgow, but I decided I couldn't stay. And I came back to Manchester, and Ian and I lived together for 30 odd years from that point on until he died from lung cancer in 1991. So it would have been our golden wedding 2 years ago if he'd lived, because we stayed together. And that's where I met him, in a cottage and a toilet in Piccadilly. Doing something that was illegal was really criminal. Well, we were criminals, according to the law at the time. But it did add a certain spice to what you were getting up to. And the same thing with the public toilets and the cinemas and in the bushes near the public toilets and things like that. Yes, it was great fun in those days. And I don't think today is nearly as good. I don't think the guys enjoy themselves as much as we did. I may be wrong. I may well be wrong. They're certainly enjoying themselves in different ways. They're not getting away with the things that we got away with simply because we were all criminals altogether.